Te Ūpoko o te ika me te hōtaka tōranga pū.
Peno tēnā no hoki koutou e te iwi, tēnei wā kai te huri tō tātou aroaro ki rā wāhi ki te whenua o Ukraina me te whenua o Ruhia me te pakanga e tū ana ki reira. So this afternoon we turn to Russia and of course to Ukraine where the Russians have started to invade the Ukraine. And we have Professor Robert Patman, who's a specialist in international relations, on the line. So thanks for joining us, Professor. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of things, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I arrived in New Zealand 30 years ago from the UK, and I've subsequently got married here and had 3 children, and I teach at the University of Otago. So, yeah, that's me, really.
So whereabouts in the UK you're from?
I was born in a place called Rochford, which is in the southeast of the country, and then lived in various parts of the country in the southwest and the northwest. And, I was teaching at the University of Surrey before I was hired at Otago. Back in the early 90s, so yeah. But I really love New Zealand and enjoy being here.
Well, the world's changed since the early 1990s, I must say.
It has. It has a lot, yes.
Now, if we look at this conflict that's happening now in the Ukraine, before the invasion, what were some of the sort of indications that we were seeing? You know, I mean, we saw that there was a build-up of troops weeks before the invasion, but before that, what were some of the indications that this was going to happen?
Well, Ukraine and Russia have been at war for 8 years because Russia in 2014 annexed part of the Ukraine's territory called the Crimea.
That's right.
And in addition, it began to support by inserting Russian troops into eastern Ukraine, began to support armed separatists in eastern Ukraine. So the two countries, the Ukraine and Russian proxies and Russia, have been at war since 2014, and about 14,000 people have died during that period. And then, as you quite rightly say, there were indications just before Russia launched a full-scale invasion on the 24th of February of this year that this was in the works because there was a sustained military build-up by Russia along Ukraine's border, not just of troops. There was about 190,000 troops assembled there during a 3-month period beforehand, but also enablers of war such as field hospitals and engineering units were put there in place. So, and as a result, the Biden administration and also governments in Western Europe, they declassified their intelligence and publicly made it available and warned that Russia was going to invade, something that Vladimir Putin, the Russian leader, denied right up to the point before he eventually took the plunge. But so we had a month or so of warnings that the Russians would invade, denials it would happen, and then finally it happened.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in this situation, did the West have a kind of a chance to stop this, or was it always going to happen?
I think it was very difficult because one of the problems is that Mr. Putin's always argued that NATO expansion, this is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which consists of European countries as well as the United States and Canada, that organization expanded with the end of the Cold War in the late 80s. And in the in the 90s and the 2000s, you saw something like 14 Eastern European countries join NATO, and that brought it closer to the borders of Russia, which, so for Mr. Putin, the Ukraine problem was symptomatic of a bigger problem, which was NATO expansionism. But, and it's a big but, you could argue that it wasn't NATO expansionism per se, because it wasn't driven by Washington. It was driven by the countries of Eastern Europe, who were making security choices based on their historical memory of Russian interference during the Cold War in their countries. So there is some concern about Russia's intentions, and many of the countries that joined NATO, all of them, didn't do so because they were urged to do so by Washington. They did so because they believed that would help cement their security. And so the other difficulty here is that Mr. Putin said one thing was the expansion of NATO that was causing a problem, and the possibility that Ukraine may join it. So he demanded two things before he invaded. Firstly, that Ukraine must never be allowed to join NATO, which is a bit like, if we put it in New Zealand terms, it's a bit like a country saying to us, you must drop your choice of going for a non-nuclear security. You know, that we exercise sovereignty in our foreign policy, and we've decided to go for non-nuclear security. So what he was really saying is that he wanted a veto over Ukraine's ability to choose its own security arrangements. And that was one thing. The second thing was he was also demanding that NATO disestablish its presence in Eastern Europe and go back to where it was in 1997. Somewhat predictably, both demands were not met. And he then decided to use what he called a military technical solution to the problem of Ukraine. The other thing we ought to add here is that Mr. Putin, shortly before he took the decision to invade, indicated in a long 65-minute presentation to the Russian people that the Ukraine was not a legitimate sovereign state. And that's why he doesn't talk about invading the country, and that's why he doesn't talk about war. He calls it a special military operation because in Mr. Putin's eyes, Ukraine is not a legitimate sovereign state. So from his point of view, it's a Russian creation, and what he's doing now is reclaiming, or in the process of trying to reclaim, what belongs to Russia.
It sounds familiar. There's another state that's similar to that in the Middle East called Israel.
Right.
But, how much did the presidency of Donald Trump embolden Putin?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think Mr. Putin made this decision to go for a full invasion based on his assessment that the United States had been weakened and divided by Trump's presidency, which, of course, Mr. Putin was Mr. Trump was President Putin's favorite president, and he liked him enormously. In fact, watching Russian state TV, I watched a clip of it on the internet just before we started speaking, and of course, the Putin regime and its supporters in Moscow are very nostalgic now for the Trump era, and they regret the emergence of Mr. Biden. But the point your question raises an important one. It may have contributed to a miscalculation by Russia. They may have believed, the Putin government may have believed, that after Afghanistan, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the United States was weakened, it was divided, and ultimately they would make a few diplomatic noises, but they wouldn't do much in response to Russia possibly annexing Ukraine. Well, that's been a big surprise, hasn't it? Because it united the West Europeans and the Americas and much of the world, because it was quite clear that a democratic, independent country was being invaded by an authoritarian regime. And it's a particular issue for us because New Zealand, because we pride ourselves on our independent foreign policy, and presumably we believe that every country, such as Ukraine, has that right as well. So, I think that, coming back to your question, I think, yes, there was probably a serious miscalculation by Mr. Putin about the reaction of the West to the invasion.
Now, running along from that question, how has Biden performed in this situation?
Excuse me. I think he's made one or two, mistakes, but I think overall he's done very well. That's my view. I think one of his wisest decisions and I know this caused a bit of what I call teeth grinding amongst intelligence officials, but he declassified the intelligence they had on the Russian build-up early on, and that was very important because, in a sense, he was serving notice to Putin that he knew what he was doing. He knew that Mr. Putin had assembled all his troops, and he was warning the world that Russia was intending to invade the Ukraine. And at first, Mr. Putin responded by saying that, the American president was scaremongering. But I think that his warnings were proven to be accurate. Biden's warnings were proven to be accurate about Putin's intentions towards Ukraine. And secondly, by giving a warning about the impossible invasion of Ukraine by Russia, I think he complicated and may have delayed Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The other thing to take into account here, I think by declassifying and publicizing this information before Putin went ahead with the invasion, I think it's created a debate in Moscow amongst those people who would otherwise support Putin. It was very interesting to me that there were retired military officials warning Putin, Russian military officials warning Putin not to go ahead with the invasion because in their views it would be a disaster. One said it certainly wouldn't be a walk in the park. I think by highlighting this information, it's added to a bit of debate within Moscow, and indeed that's one of the challenges that Mr. Putin faces now because he did not achieve what he thought he would achieve, which was a quick overrunning of Ukraine. And now, of course, he seems to be bogged down in what looks like a bit of a military stalemate now.
Could this be the end of Putin?
Very difficult to read, isn't it, with an authoritarian regime. What we do know is that there are restive or unsettled elements in the Russian military. I mean, Russian casualties in this war, this brief conflict, have been really substantial. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000, perhaps even more, Russian troops have died in the first month of this conflict. That's more than the Soviet Union lost in its 8 years when it invaded and occupied Afghanistan between 1979 and 1987. So these are substantial losses. They've also lost a lot of armor and hardware at the hands of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have actually performed much better than many people expected, and Ukraine has used the technology that's been given to them very, very adeptly, and they adroitly, I should say. And I think that in short, I think what the war tells us is that we probably all underestimated the Ukrainian military performance and overestimated the Russian military performance.
One question I have here is why are Russian oligarchs seemingly attracted to the UK?
That's a good question, isn't it? I think it's mainly because the British government had a special visa regime where if they invested in London, it's called Londongrad now. This is a serious problem. They found it very attractive because most of the people around Putin love to denounce the West, but they all send their children to be educated in the West. Many of the oligarchs like to have palatial pads in London, and they're not short of money. So they can enjoy the freedoms of the West. I think the other thing here is that it helps Putin's foreign policy because many of these oligarchs serve informally of representing Putin's interests. For example, 36 conservative MPs have received donations from Russian oligarchs. In fact, the Johnson government actually promoted the son of an intelligence officer to the House of Lords. This is Mr. Lebedev. He's now called Lord of Siberia. And in the 2 years since Johnson's been Prime Minister, the Conservative ruling party have received $2 million in donations from Russian oligarchs closely connected to Putin. So you could say that the Russians are attracted to London. They like the lifestyle and also the tax breaks and the visa, the ability to operate there. But also it serves as a way of influencing perhaps British politics. There's no doubt about it. Mr. Putin had a key strategic goal of Britain leaving the EU, and of course that was achieved with Brexit.
Yeah, absolutely. With these Russians in the oligarchs in the UK, could that come to an end soon because of what's happened with this war?
They're being sanctioned, and the Johnson government has done a bit of a U-turn since this crisis broke out. It's taken quite a firm line against the Russian invasion. In fact, I think it's one of the biggest providers of military equipment, particularly missiles, anti-missile systems, to the Ukrainian government, and they've adopted quite a prominent position in doing that. They're also in the process now of finally clamping down on the oligarchs closely connected with Putin and sanctioning them. For example, a well-known person who used to be owner of, he's currently owner
Abramovich.
Technically, yeah, Abramovich. He's found himself sanctioned and he's had to go back to Russia. So I think the club's, Chelsea Football Club's now being placed in some sort of trust, temporary ownership, but technically it still belongs to him. But yes, Abramovich is one amongst many of these oligarchs that they've moved against. Less prominent ones may not be sanctioned yet, but I've noticed that there is some debate going on in Britain calling for much tougher measures against these people who operate with the blessing of the Putin regime in London.
Just looking at this election in America recently, where we've had the Russians being accused of interfering with it, is that going to happen with these midterms coming up? Are we going to see stuff like that happening in the United States, or have they sort of taken measures to secure themselves a bit better?
That's a very good question. It's very difficult to know. What we do know, with the advent of the social media in the last 15 years, the chances of foreign actors interfering in the domestic politics of other countries has increased. And, so we can't rule it out. We do know that the Russians took an active interest in the 2016-2020 election. And, and they are certainly, given the pro-Trump orientation of the Republican Party, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some, active support from Russia for pro-Trump Republicans in the elections coming up.
Hey, Professor Robert Patman, we've run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you for sharing with us your time and your knowledge and your thoughts on the international goings-on at the moment, and I look forward to having another chat with you in the not-too-distant future.
Well, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. Really enjoyed your questions. Thank you.
E te iwi ko ahorangi Robert Patman tērā, ko tāna aronga, ana ko ngā hononga o rā wāhi. Hoi anōra, tēnā hoki ko tau whakaronga tonu mai ki tō tātou taonga te Ūpoko tika.
Te Hōtaka Tōranga Pū, 5 to 7 p.m. every Wednesday with Thomas and Moki on Te Ūpoko o te Ika.